All right. So the next stage that we have is to talk about circuits that include capacitors in them. So we will omit the resistors for now, but the working and the equivalent capacitance are unfortunately the complete opposite of the equivalent resistances that we've just been working on the past week. So if we have this circuit here, we've got a battery providing an EMF on the far left, and then we have two capacitors that are in parallel. And so when we talk about this circuit, we can talk about the total charge that is being provided and the total charge that can be stored here will include the charge that's stored on capacitor 1 and the charge stored on capacitor 2. And I do just want to have you remember or recall that for a capacitor, the charge is equal to the capacitance times the voltage drop across that across the capacitor. And so this becomes important because then we can write equivalent expressions down here to tell you that the charge total for both of them would be capacitance 1 times the voltage drop of the capacitor plus the capacitance 2 times the voltage drop of the capacitor. It's worth noting that the voltage drop of each capacitor is also the voltage drop of the battery, as all three elements are in parallel with one another. But the next step that we really want to try and get to here is that both of these delta V's are the same. And so I can mathematically pull out these delta V, the capacitors, and I'm left with C plus C2. And so for these two capacitors in parallel, I can write a generic expression with equivalent capacitance. So E equivalent for two capacitors in parallel is the sum of their capacitance. Again, the totally opposite of resistors, which is unfortunate. But what it does mean is that we can rewrite this circuit with two parallel resistors as if it was one capacitor with an equivalent resistance equal to the sum of the two capacitors. And then, of course, that can be totally generalized to include as many capacitors as happen to be in parallel with one another. Okay, so capacitors in parallel, their capacitance sum together to create an equivalent capacitance. We then can consider two capacitors in series with one another instead. And just at the top again, I'll quickly recall that the charge is equal to the capacitance times the change in voltage across. And then, because I'm going to need it in just a minute, I can solve this for the capacitance, and this will be the charge over the delta VC. Now this works a little bit differently, because keep in mind that if we are considering the voltage drop across both the capacitors, those have to sum together to be the voltage drop across the battery. And so you have a slightly different starting setup. You can make the statement that the voltage drop across the capacitance equivalent, if you're trying to make an equivalent circuit, would have to be the sum of the voltage drop across the first capacitor and the voltage drop across the second capacitor. And so if I want to try and work with this, I can also rewrite this up here as the delta V of the capacitor is equal to the Q over C. And so this voltage drop of the capacitance equivalent would be equal to Q over C1 plus Q over C2. They both share the Q value, so if I pull out the Q value, I would have 1 over C1 plus 1 over C2 equals the voltage drop of the equivalent capacitance. And so, right, I can go one more just to like make it really kind of clear. If I do my delta V, my delta VC, I want to do, I want to get the Q over the delta VC equivalent, which would be 1 over C1 plus 1 over C2. And so this whole expression here is my equivalent capacitance. So equivalent capacitance is 1 over C1 plus 1 over C2, which we would typically write this as 1 over C1 plus 1 over C2 equals 1 over C equivalent, which is, this looks or feels like the equivalent resistance of two resistors in parallel. Okay, so again, totally opposite of resistors. So if you have capacitors that are in series with one another, in order to find the equivalent resistance, you have to do the inverse sums and actually solve for the equivalent resistance. So you can consider these two capacitors together as if they were one capacitor with this value of the equivalent resistance. And of course, you can generically have it for as many capacitors as you might have in series as well. Okay, let me check my time real fast. Or try to, okay, maybe I can. So let's maybe take a moment and look at an ABCD question. Which of the following combinations of capacitors has the highest capacitance? So why don't you go ahead and pause the video and take a moment and actually calculate these equivalent capacitance for each of these particular cases. Or better yet, I will make another video and you'll have to check the other video to get your solution. So find your equivalent capacitance for each of these three circuits before you open up the next video.